Good evening. It's such an honor to be with you. I can't think of a place I'd rather be tonight than with you all. They're at the College of Sequoias. So I'm so sad to miss the conversations that y'all will have this evening as you socialize. What I've prepared for you tonight is a combination of rationale, a little bit of recalling experience, and a whole bunch of vision of multi-benefit floodplain restoration. And I think when you stack all these things together, it paints a really beautiful picture of hope, of recovery, of giving new life to Tulare Lake. Let's get started. Before I jump into multi-benefit floodplain restoration, I want to share a little bit with you about me and my story. I'm a third-generation Californian. My family is mostly preachers and teachers, and I hope what that says to you is I come from a family of people who really believe in the power of community and the power of people. I bring that, to my life and to my career. I grew up in the shadow of Mount Diablo, and I turned to the mountain in my youth and in my adolescence to really figure out who I am. I felt both connected to nature and the ground and the community in which I was growing up, but also, insignificant in the scheme of the dynamics of this planet and the universe around us, right? And I think that had a grounding effect. It does have a grounding effect on people as we're developing. So I developed a strong conservation ethic growing up in that area as I watched the land around me become residential housing developments and golf courses. I knew I wanted to study natural resources, so I studied forestry and soil science. Like most people who grew up in the Bay Area, I didn't know what the valley was. I didn't know until in my 20s I moved it to Merced and learned about the incredible sophistication of the agricultural setting in the Central Valley and what amazing, production really looks like in food production, but also witnessed firsthand, the tremendous tragedy of dewatering the Central Valley and all that we've lost as that happened. But the thing that struck me the most moving to Merced and moving to the Central Valley was discovering that Californians just like me, who have been disconnected from nature for so long, have forgotten how important it is to have open natural spaces as you're growing up and as your community is thriving. People who were living in my neighborhood in Merced had no idea that there were rivers nearby. And to them, when you talked about where do you go to experience nature, it was we drive to Yosemite. That was pretty challenging. My job interview brought me out to the San Joaquin River, and I met with the director of field operations, Stephen Shepard. Stephen grew up farming tomatoes in Chowchilla, and he was excited to show me the project he had been working on, some over 1,000 acre floodplain restoration project called the San Joaquin River National Wildlife Refuge. It's this image that you see on this slide here. So Stephen, I got into his pickup truck and he said, I'm going to show you a project. And we drove up onto a levee slope and slowly toured around the corner. And in front of my eyes, I saw a restored 400-acre white lake on the floodplain of the San Joaquin River. I saw hundreds of acres of replanted cottonwood, willow, and valley oak forests. I saw a flush of probably 200 white pelicans fly up out of the lake. And Stephen turns to me and says, "This is what we do." I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "Well, about 5 years ago, this was all tomatoes." And I knew from that point forward that giving new life back to the valley, not just for the dwindling wildlife and the lost, rivers and wetlands, but for the people of the valley, was something that I want to dedicate my life to. Quick story is as those pelicans took off, as I was looking at White Lake for the first time, Stephen chuckled and he said, "Yeah, what's interesting is that road that you met me on, where I picked you up for this drive around tour. It's called Pelican Road." And people had forgotten why it was called Pelican Road until a few years ago when we put water back on this landscape, and the pelicans came back the very next year. So is a beautiful illustration of how people forget, but the dynamics on our planet, the dynamics of nature, don't forget. And as long as people can find themselves in a place where we're connected to nature, we won't forget about the beautiful ecology of our valley and how to recover it. So now I've been with River Partners for about 18 years. First, I was an ecologist and a project manager, then a fundraiser, and now I get to be the president of this amazing organization. This map shows you where River Partners works, mostly in the Central Valley, but really up and down the state of California. Our story is one of learning. River Partners was founded in 1998 with a mission to create wildlife habitat for the benefit of people and the environment. We've learned from various cross-sector partnerships in the valley about exactly how we can recover lost ecosystems and exactly what benefit those recovered ecosystems play for people as well as for wildlife. The first big lessons we learned were how to use farming practices in large-scale restoration. We were founded by farmers, and it was pretty clear that the field of restoration could be revolutionized. If ecologists who are thinking about the recovery of natural ecosystems and native ecosystems could actually tap into the skill and the talent of the farming community of Central Valley. And we got to work scaling up restoration using the ingenuity of farmers, using tractors, using large-scale irrigation systems, and we've now restored over 20,000 acres of floodplains along the major rivers in the Central Valley since 1998. The second big lesson we learned was in the flood management community, right? As soon as we started planting a lot of trees down by the river, especially in between the levees along the river, the flood engineers started coming to us and saying, wait a second, those trees are going to cause problems because my engineering plans don't have trees in the floodway. And I want water to move as fast as possible through this floodway, and those trees are going to cause problems for me. So after a lot of partnership and integration work, we figured out a way to get the flood engineers speaking the same language as the restoration ecologists, working with farmers to scale up. And we now have a pretty solid relationship with the flood management community. We even have a conservation strategy that's been integrated into the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, which describes recovery of wildlife and recovery of ecosystems within the flood system. What a major win. River Partners' story has been one of being invited to learn over and over and over again. Most recently, we've been invited by the Native American tribes of the Central Valley to learn more about how restoration of native vegetation and wildlife supports cultural revitalization, basketry, and ceremony and medicine. It's been incredibly enriching, and we're just scratching the surface about how to really make sure that recovery of lost ecosystems, lost wet ecosystems of the valley benefits people in that way. Sigma represents another opportunity to learn, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And our problem statement really is that California has lost 95% of its wet ecosystems, from 1890, where you see all the little greens and blues on this map of the Central Valley represent wetlands and riparian forests, floodplain habitats, and aquatic environments around 1890 to today, around 2020, they're almost all completely gone. And this isn't just an esoteric, bummer, we lost our wetlands. As you guys all know, this is driving extinction, not just extinction of wildlife, but also extinction of quality of life, extinction of culture, and a loss of climate resilience for the entire state, and more importantly, for the food basket of this country. As an organization dedicated to wildlife habitat, we think about the whole suite of wildlife that depend upon rivers. That's a lot more than just the fish in the water, right? A river is so much more than the blue line on the stream. A river swells and shrinks, right? It spreads across the landscape and fills lakes and basins. It drains through deltas, and eventually most of our water of the Central Valley drains through the Golden Gate, right? And as it does, it feeds forests and grasslands and hills and supports all manner of wildlife. All of the critters that you see here and so many more really are fundamentally reliant upon watersheds, and our rivers. So it's a really fun experience to imagine how a single piece of property could be transformed with water and vegetation to make homes for the highest diversity of critters you can imagine. Maybe second only to how fun it is to think about how those restoration projects can be used to transform the quality of water and air that people drink and breathe, or the quality of life that people live. One of the highlights of my career has been the Dos Rios State Park project in the western edge of Modesto, nestled into the San Joaquin River National Wildlife Refuge, which is where I met Stephen Shepard on that day, the first time I met River Partners so long ago. We were able to launch California's first new state park in over 13 years on January 12th of 2024. And here's Dolores Huerta celebrating with us with a chant of "Si se puede," right? Yes, we can. So, as I mentioned before, Central Valley communities lack access to natural spaces, and it's been so lacking that our communities have forgotten about how important access to natural spaces really are. I highly recommend anybody who has the time and energy, if you're coming by Modesto at any time, please call, and we'll take you on a fun tour of Dos Rios where you can see restored floodplains in action. So I don't need to tell any of you that California agriculture is amazing. I love this little graphic, which just shows, the proportion of total production for the country in different crops. And you see, consistently almost every little map of the contiguous U.S. you see here, the green is in California. We grow everything. And our agricultural sustainability really does demand that we have healthy watersheds and healthy rivers, right? From the pollinators that we rely on to the water that we need to pump to grow food. Our healthy rivers and our healthy watersheds safeguard our productivity and a huge economy, right? Keep our nation in fresh food. When I was in college, I wound up going to the Pacific Islands for a few years. I got to study in Tahiti and in Hawaii, and I learned that Polynesian cultures have this whole political boundary system called an ahupua'a, or it's a watershed. And, different, instead of the wackadoo, shapes of the states of the United States like we have that are based on whatever weirdness they're based on, many of them actually use the river as the boundary between two jurisdictions, which is crazy. But an ahupua'a uses the watershed as the political boundary. And so in Pacific Islands, where the islands are small and the watersheds are small, you can see from the top of the watershed all the way down to the estuary. And if somebody in the upper watershed is doing something that might be influencing the way that water moves through the middle part of the watershed, or out through the beaches and the sands, or out into the water where you're farming fish. California's watershed, from the top of Mount Whitney to the Golden Gate and beyond, is no different than those same kinds of systems, except that we've drawn our political boundaries strangely, and our watershed is huge. You can't stand anywhere and see from the top to the bottom. And that makes it really hard for us to think about how management actions we take in the middle part of the system influence the way the upper system works and the lower system works. But fundamentally, they're all deeply connected, right? What happens with our snowpack has a tremendous impact on what happens with farming, what happens with fish as they swim out to sea and come back, and of course, what happens to people and communities and our jobs and our way of life. I wanted to show you this graphic just because it really drives home the climate trends, that we're experiencing in California. All the way at the end of the spectrum on the left is, the year 1900 going all the way to the year 2020. And what you can see is not only are we getting longer periods of droughts and longer periods of wetness, but we're also getting higher intensity wetness and droughts. So you see a trend from 1885 to 2022 just getting hotter and drier. We've built in California an entire water delivery system, an entire flood management system that's predicated on the watersheds of California, our temperature and our water meeting expectations from the past, not into the future. So we have our work cut out for us if we really do want to maintain agricultural productivity and the provision of water to cities and communities and flood safety in California. One of the major drivers here of this California water whiplash is, of course, our warming atmosphere, which, as the atmosphere warms, it can carry more moisture. So that higher moisture content in the jet stream, the wind pattern that blows air from the Pacific over California, so much water can be carried in that wind that we can see, volumes of water like as large as the Sacramento River fall in a single watershed in a single storm event. And that's going to continue, that intensity is going to continue to increase as we continue emitting carbon into the atmosphere. And it also drives changes in, of course, temperature on the ground, and thus the utility of the water that melts off of the Sierras and down into our wetlands and rivers. And so I don't expect us to absorb this graph on the left today or tonight, but I wanted to show you that, thinking about the Ahupua'a, or the system of watershed management, this map or this graphic is an illustration of California's watershed. You see source waters on the left, receiving watersheds on the right, and in between the built and the natural hubs of water movement across the state. What a spaghetti mess. It's amazing how water that falls in the north part of the state primarily and in the Sierras makes its way to coastal and Southern California through many different ways. What's important to note is, the population of California has grown faster than probably any other human population that we have records of. In less than 200 years, growing to 40 million people, it's insanity. As our climate continues to shift, our water supplies are diminishing. There are always, of course, the drumbeats of surface water storage. We should build more dams to try to keep some of this water where we need to use it the most. But I'm hoping that we're, as innovations continue to progress around us, we become more enlightened in the way that we think about our watersheds. We have at present a series of surface water reservoirs that rely upon snowpack, that capture a little bit of water, and that distribute, sometimes up to 80% or 90% of our stream flow through giant canals and ditches that are crumbling because the land beneath them is subsiding because we've overused our groundwater. What an incredible opportunity we have as the snowpack is shrinking, and we know it will continue to shrink. What a tremendous opportunity we have to use the water beneath our feet, or the space beneath our feet, to store water. Additionally, there's so much we still don't know, but we need to learn about, in the way that a wet environment in the middle of our watershed, right, in the bottom of the valley, in the Tulare Lake bed, and in the San Joaquin Valley, San Joaquin River floodplains, what does water standing in the bottom of the valley do to local precipitation patterns and water temperatures? I'd guess a lot. And I'm sure there are people here in the room who have good ideas about that. So my hope is that as we really come to the realization that our water supplies are dwindling, we can think differently about how our watersheds work, try to really focus on getting more water in the ground, and use the bottom of our valley, the very precious bottom of our valley, as a place for abundant water, not a place to suck water dry. So here I'm showing you the cover of the 2022 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. I'm really proud that a lot of the conservation community worked on integrating floodplain restoration into this plan, which is the third update of our comprehensive plan for flood management for the Central Valley. The cover of the plan features restored floodplain on the San Joaquin River near Dos Rios State Park, and the plan itself, while it doesn't cover the Tulare Basin, I think it covers a lot of the dynamics that are important for recovery of Pa'ashi, including protecting small communities by reducing water surface elevations in the space between the levees, by spreading water out across the landscape for recharge, and by using those recharge and floodwater attenuation spaces as places for restoration of native ecology that's stimulated by flooding instead of damaged by it. So who recognizes this structure? Yeah, this is actually the place where the Kings River drains into the San Joaquin River above a certain threshold cubic feet per second of flow. This is the head of the James Bypass and the Fresno Slough, which carries water that would have typically filled up the Tulare Lake Basin and allows it to drain out to the Delta. This water accumulates in the San Joaquin River and flows all the way out to Stockton. And it drives higher flood risk for a lot of communities north of the Tulare Basin. It's also a place where the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan stops, which seems odd because of all the water that drains out of Tulare Lake and creates flood risk for folks between Fresno and the Delta. This image is stolen from Erica Geis, who's an amazing author who wrote a fabulous book called Water Always Wins. And I love sharing this image because it just helps us understand kind of what groundwater really looks like. We hear a lot about how much groundwater storage there is available underneath the Central Valley, especially the San Joaquin Valley. But what does it really look like? Is it some giant cavern, beneath the ground surface somewhere where water can accumulate? No. What groundwater is really the differences in soil texture that have been buried in the alluvium as the Sierra Nevadas have eroded over time. And so really erosion coming off of the Sierra Nevadas has always been carried by water, for millennia, carried by water down to the very flat valley floor, and the water has meandered across the landscape as it slows down, carrying with it sediments of fine grains and sediments of coarse grain material. And as those old river channels are buried through lots and lots of erosion and deposition, they become paleo channels, buried old channels. Those lenses that are particularly gravelly and sandy can actually convey water from the surface to the ground into deep storage very rapidly. So in those places where we can let water spread out across the landscape, where we have a good expectation that a paleo channel is intersecting with the surface of the ground, or where we can slow down water in a river channel where we know the base of the river is actually connected to sands and gravels that percolate down into the ground, we know that we're getting a lot of recharge as a result of spreading that water out. And so this map on the left shows you an illustration of some of that technology. This is a few years old now, but it's aerial electromagnetic imagery, basically an MRI of the surface of the planet. This data was taken by DWR, flown in an airplane with a giant magnet hanging down. And it shoots electromagnetic current into the ground, and as quickly as that current bounces back, it can map down to a depth of 1,500 feet. What are the soil textures? So on this map, the blue stuff is heavy clay. The green stuff is kind of loamy, and the yellow and orange and even getting into red are sandy, gravelly places. The pink is bedrock, so don't think about that for recharge. If you kind of map what we know now about the below ground geophysics of the Central Valley over that old, historic map of wet ecosystems of the valley, you can start to see the history of water, flowing across the valley that has led to this accumulation of sediments in these patterns. But you can also see where restoration of floodplains and ecosystems can be a core driver for groundwater recharge. Now, this is the part of this talk where I get to share with you some of our experiences. This is a picture of before and after of a restoration project along the lower Feather River in Yuba County, going from bare dirt that has this history of being tilled, no organic matter left in it, really just annihilated soil ecology. And then in 4 short years, it's hosting a completely native vegetation community that's populated with native wildlife. The only thing missing from this image is the people. Where are the people who steward and care for this restored landscape? We know that the restoration of river ecosystems and floodplains is building our climate resilience by doing so many things. And I haven't even talked about carbon with you yet. When we I have teams of people at River Partners who do this, but we read all of these conservation plans that have been written over the last few decades, whether they're water conservation plans or wildlife conservation plans or soil conservation plans. And when you stack them all up on top of each other, especially the flood management plans that have been written, you see that we need at least 100,000 acres of riverway and floodplain restoration in the next decade. I hope a lot of that is located in places where we can envision a restored edge, fringe, mass, crescent of the Pa'ashi, right? There's got to be places, and I know a few already, where we can, at the scale of hundreds or even thousands of acres, bring life back to the landscape in a coordinated and strategic way so that we have natural spaces to enjoy and love, our native wildlife have places to come back, and our environmental health improves. It's another gorgeous before and after that I love to show, right? That you can see that tiny tractor in the 2018 picture is just preparing this agricultural field for planting. This is a part of the landscape where the floodplain has been laser leveled, and thousands of acres of laser level fields have been irrigated with gravity alone to produce food for cows primarily. When we view this landscape through a different lens, a lens kind of looking at the future and a new value set, we see that we can have something so much more than an alfalfa field of enormous magnitude. We can have a diverse forest that hosts populations, recovered populations of deer where they haven't been for 60 or 70 years. My goodness, could we imagine having a herd of tule elk roaming in the bottom of the valley? Certainly recovered populations of bunnies and wood rats and coyotes, all of the critters that had trouble making a living in that alfalfa field. So if we need to get to 100,000 acres or more, how the heck are we going to do that, right? In 27 years, River Partners has done 1/5 of what that is. Like, there's no way it's just business as usual. This is a movement. We need to scale, and we need to scale as we learn. So a couple of the big kind of philosophies of scaling here in this restoration community that we're all a part of, right, is first and foremost, probably the most important. And it's what we're doing here tonight and what you're all doing in this lecture series and in your studies and in your communication work, is recognizing the importance of the landscape and this watershed that's far beyond our local neighborhood. Really recognizing how it's not just the agricultural products of the valley that have a global influence. It's the water of the valley and the physical dynamics of water in our valley they have significance far beyond even the valley itself, in global migrations of wildlife, in the way that people interact with one another. This is a very important place, and we usually don't give the Tulare Basin or the San Joaquin Valley the importance that they deserve. Partnerships are the center, partnerships that are really focused on taking action with respect and with dialogue. This is how we learn, right? So really focusing not on, I'm going to spend my life telling you that you're wrong and I'm right? Not spending our lives spinning stories without any kind of like leverage or action behind it. Really living in partnership that takes action, and then making sure that the action that is taken is done respectfully and in dialogue with the others around us. This is a huge scaling philosophy, right? It is so tremendous when you can find partnerships that are dedicated to taking action and focused on respect and dialogue. Another big component of scaling restoration and thinking about how we could get to a Tulare Lake of the future are relying on concepts that are proven and that are rooted in abundance. And see, in the water world in California, it is so easy to get bogged down in a mentality of scarcity, that there's not enough to go around. There's not enough land, there's not enough water, there's not enough money. And I think, in my experience on the ground, what I've seen is that when the outcome is important enough, there's enough. And so tackling restoration from a perspective of abundance instead of a perspective of scarcity is transformative. It invites partnerships with more and more power to change things on the landscape. So I really encourage, everybody in this room to have a bit of a meditation on this topic of scarcity and abundance and think, how do I live scarcity and abundance in my own life? We, of course, have to have a commitment to learning and relearning over and over again, not be afraid of making mistakes. And then returning our climate cycles and dynamics, really learning how does our gigantic watershed from the top of the Sierras to the Golden Gate, how does it really work? There's some amazing ideas out there about how all of the things that we've lost as the Tule fog has really gone away, and so much more. We need to learn, and we need to be comfortable saying maybe we got it wrong, because we're gonna learn more as we continue to re-wet and rewild this landscape. So now I'm going to run through a series of slides that I think when you stack them all together really paint a picture of what a revitalized Tulare Lake could be. And it's not a line on a map. It's not a picture. It's not a piece of property. It's something more than that, because the scale of recovery really that we're talking about in a region as large as the Tulare Basin is a lot more than what river partners or the conservation community can do. It needs to be a movement. So first and foremost, a restored Tulare Lake provides reliable, safe, fresh water for generations to come. And that's farm water, city water, and ecosystem water. A restored Tulare Lake is also a landscape feature that keeps communities safe from flooding, not a landscape feature that threatens communities with flooding. A restored Tulare Lake contributes to the sustainability of a reliable and safe food production, really for the world is consuming Central Valley agricultural products. But it's also a place for jobs in transition. As we think about how many jobs have been lost in agriculture over the last 50 years as we've mechanized things, and now as we stare down the face of Sigma, how scary it is to imagine that even those precious few jobs that remain in agriculture in the valley might be at risk. A restored Tulare Lake is not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen through the labor of thousands of people. So, can a restored Tulare Lake perhaps represent jobs in transition as we keep our sustainable food supply up and running? As we heard so beautifully in Vice Chair Jeff's talk in this lecture series about the cultural revitalization that's possible and really the healing that could occur with a reintroduction of the Tulare Lake, revitalization of the Tulare Lake, or multi-benefit floodplain restoration in general, that's accessible. We see that the value to people, especially those people who represent a culture that's been here for millennia and is infused with such deep ecological knowledge as the basket weavers, the medicine makers, the ceremony and the practice of Native American cultures. Restored Tulare Lake obviously could be an incredible cultural asset, but even the act of restoring it can be healing and revitalizing. The Tulare Lake doesn't have to just be a spot of wet on the landscape. It can be a place of lasting wildlife recovery for terrestrial species like bunnies, for insects like the monarch butterfly that's on the brink of extinction, and of course for aquatic critters that live in rivers, streams, and wetlands fringing the lake, wherever that restored lake might happen to be. It would be crazy to imagine that a restored Tulare Lake didn't provide healthy access to the outdoors for all Central Valley residents. And one of my favorite integrations to think about for the future is how the process of bringing back a revitalized Pa'ashi could actually be just like agricultural innovation is so strong in Central Valley communities, restoration, ecological restoration could be a space for career building and innovation and how we use technology to track how ecosystems recover and how people maintain and interact with them. This is an aerial image of about a 500-acre piece of ground that we were able to purchase last year for floodplain restoration. This isn't in the Tulare Basin, but it's in Merced County at a place called Mariposa Slough. It looks to me like a blank canvas. And when I look at the watercourse, flowing across the landscape here, what I see is water dynamics that are kind of chained in with hard banks and roads along the edge. But what I see here is a tremendous opportunity to reconnect, right? Can you imagine if you can find efficient ways to use gravity to make that water spread out further across this landscape, and then do the hard work of getting native vegetation reestablished across this land? Then the next time a big water event happens, snowmelt or otherwise, and that stream, that slough is really pumping with water, we can see that excess water, nuisance floodwater, turn into abundant recharge and abundant ecosystem revitalization. Now this is an image of a restored, reforested floodplain underwater. And we've learned a lot as we've seen restoration projects get wet with big water years like this one in 2023. So this is part of a 5,000-acre restored floodplain in the San Joaquin Valley. And what these cottonwoods and willows and valley oaks are doing is they're getting rejuvenated by several months of deep inundation from this water, but they're also cleaning the water. And they're also slowing it down so that aquatic wildlife can live in it and thrive in it and raise their babies in it. This is really important for salmon, but it's also really important for the whole suite of wildlife that depend upon rivers in the Central Valley. So I borrowed this image from YouTube, and it's an image of the Tulare Lake Basin in 2023. What's amazing about this photo to me is the scale. You see those little yellow tractors on the levee's edge. It's a lot of water, and it does represent a huge amount of damage when the landscape's not prepared to accept this much water. But through multi-benefit floodplain restoration, we can actually find those places and where it makes sense for the water to spread across the landscape and sink in. And we can actually work with willing sellers and willing water managers to put this water to positive use, to flip this damage into something that's a tremendous community asset. And guess what? When it's dry, it's useful for hiking and collecting vegetation and food. It's also helpful for all kinds of terrestrial wildlife that almost went extinct in the valley floor because we've annihilated their habitat so badly. So I want to turn our attention now to tangibly, how do we do multi-benefit floodplain restoration in the Tulare Basin, or how do we give life back to a viable portion of Pa'ashi in our lifetimes? It's important that we name that time frame, right? Because if it doesn't happen while we're watching, it's going to be harder to recruit the next generation of folks who are going to have this vision and keep pushing it forward. But I'm optimistic. I know we can do it. So here are the steps, and this is pretty simple. It's not rocket science. You need to entitle land and water for a new purpose. And then you need to talk to everybody. And I mean all of the common partners and all of the uncommon partners, to figure out how to articulate the purpose of revitalizing Pa'ashi for everybody, right? We're not going to go down a path of excluding people. It's not going to work, right? So what will work to bringing life back to Pa'ashi is finding places with willing partners and finding ways to speak to across all sectors about how it can benefit them, in turn benefiting all of us. We have to design and build it. No easy task. Very expensive, very complicated, requires tons of technological and technical expertise. A part that we often forget about is that then we have to care for it and nurture it. It's not about put water back on the landscape and let it be, and the pelicans will come back and we'll be all good. Never. Right? People are going to have to care and nurture for a revitalized Pa'ashi, but I contend that people always have cared and nurtured for Pa'ashi. long before we built the dams and the aqueducts, long before we drained the valley and leveled those fields. People have been caring for this lake. Let's really live in that reality and figure out how are people going to care for this lake moving forward. And then finally, this is probably the most important tactical thing that supports recovery of Pa'ashi, and that's keep learning. Be intentional about continuing to learn. I've heard really beautiful stories about how if we can get some water accumulated in the Tulare Basin, we can actually change fog dynamics, that will actually change snow dynamics, that will actually make our watershed more abundant. Can you imagine? We just have a lot of learning to do. So this is near and dear to my heart, but it's also the ethos of River Partners and the whole community of people that we work with, which is we give life back to a viable portion of the landscape by getting to work now. Get to work today. It might not be perfect. It might not be the highest priority, but it is going to be progress. And the need here is so large that it's more important for us to make progress than to be surgically precise in every investment that we make in bringing life back to the bottom of the valley. I have some amazing news on the topic of making stuff happen. In this picture, which was taken on Tuesday, you can see amazing Senator Melissa Hurtado, a River Partner, Bill Eisenstein, standing right behind Vice Chair Robert Jeff, who spoke to you all earlier in this lecture series, and the mayor of McFarland, Saul Ione, all of whom were testifying in front of the Senate Committee on Water and Wildlife on Tuesday about Senate Bill 556. Senator Hurtado has advanced a bill to bring floodplain restoration investment to Senate District 16, the Tulare Basin. And we couldn't be happier to report that in the Senate subcommittee on Tuesday, it was voted unanimously to be worked into the state budget. Okay, so in closing, I just have to say that there are, of course, way too many folks doing really helpful work across the Tulare Basin to try to make progress, to try to demonstrate actions we can take, to try to bite off meaningful components of recovery of the Tulare Lake. The Tule River Trust and Valley Eco and the Nature Conservancy and River Partners working on a project at Caponero Creek, transitioning old dairy fields into native habitat that benefits pollinators and other critters. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Land Management, this is the time of federal chaos, don't get me wrong, but at the National Wildlife Refuge and at Atwell Island, these agencies are continuing what they've been working on for decades, which is finding ways to bring back wildlife habitat. And they're willing partners in integration and multi-benefit floodplain restoration all over the lands that they manage. California State Parks, the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, and California's Department of Water Resources, they are all in on the idea of multi-benefit floodplain restoration as a tool for meeting our water needs, as support for reducing our irrigation demand across the valley, and as a tool to create community assets to really rectify the problem with nature access across the San Joaquin Valley. All of these groups working together, doing amazing work, and I'm sorry I've left so many off the list here. It just is the nature of partnerships to not be able to name them all. But of course, I have to wrap by saying everybody in the room, the time that you've spent in this lecture series, the time that you've spent listening to me babble on, looking at pretty pictures about what multi-benefit floodplain restoration is and how it relates to restoration of the lake, you are doing tremendous work to think about, listen, and support a growing movement, right? The California Native Plant Society, the Power in Nature Coalition, and of course the genius Barbara Breidoff for pulling us all together in such a beautiful way. So thank you for spending your time, and I'll be here for a few minutes of questions and answers. And again, I really desperately wish I could be there socializing with you tonight. Thank you.